Hi everyone. What we're going to do now is have a look at the market mechanism and how it relates to the oil market. So bear with me as I bring up my presentation. Could take a couple of seconds for this to load up. Hopefully you're going to start to see something on your screen very shortly. Just going to change a couple of settings and we should be off and up and running. So hopefully you know who I am, and what we're going to do is look at how oil price fluctuations are a result of our market mechanism of supply and demand. Oil's a pretty good product for us to have a look at. It's used everywhere around us in our cars and in our aeroplanes, in our central heating, or if you're lucky enough to live outside of Scotland, perhaps air conditioning. We have fertilizers. It's used in makeup products and all kinds of plastics. So it's a good product for us to have a look at. So let's go with a quiz question to start with. Which of these years do you think saw the highest oil price in real terms? 1780, 1860, 1920, 1960, or 1980? Well, you might be surprised to find that the answer is actually 1860. Shortly after the first US commercial oil well was drilled and in the run-up to the Civil War in America. Let's have a look at the market mechanism then. What is it? It's the law of demand, where for most goods, when the price is higher, the quantity demanded is lower, together with the law of supply, where for most goods, when the price is higher, the quantity supplied is higher too. We bring those together, and where the supply curve meets the demand curve, we get our equilibrium price, PE, and our equilibrium quantity, QE. Okay, so let's look at these in a bit more detail. First of all, the demand curve. So what happens when price changes? Well, when price increases, we'll move along the curve in the direction of the arrow up the way, but when price decreases, we will see a movement along the curve in the downward arrow direction. Non-price factors will shift the curve entirely to the left or to the right, and so more or less will be demanded at every price. So what are these non-price factors in the demand for oil? Well, clearly, in the winter, people will demand more oil for their central heating, and in summer, for their air conditioning. How many cars are on the roads and the substitute products will affect the demand for oil too. Unfortunately, in times of war, we will see the demand for oil increase as production of war-related products increases. It could be that climate change activists can impact on people's decisions about which products they want to use and could impact the demand for oil. And typically, as the economy grows, the demand for oil would go up as well. And if the population is growing, it would increase too. So what that would mean is that our demand curve D0 in this diagram, when we see a demand curve shift out to the right, it will look like a move to D1. And when we see the demand curve move to the left, it will shift to D2. Okay, that's the demand curve, so let's have a look at the supply curve. And again, as the price increases, remember we move along the curve. As the price increases in the direction of the green arrow up the way, and where it decreases in the direction of the green arrow down the way, but again along the curve. Whereas non-price factors shift the higher curve and more or less supplied at every price. So what are these non-price factors relating to the supply of oil? Well, clearly, profitability of alternatives will impact the suppliers. If the price of solar or wind or nuclear becomes higher than oil, then they may switch. Clearly, oil discoveries will impact the supply of oil. Climate change activists and lobbyists for climate change may impact the behavior of firms in supply as well as we saw earlier with demand. Government subsidies, if they are introduced or removed, can increase or decrease the amount that will be supplied. Cartels such as OPEC, where countries get together, can restrict the supply of oil. And technology changes such as the introduction of fracking in the American market really increased the supply of oil worldwide. So let's put that together with our supply curve. And again, we can see that when the entire curve shifts to the left, the supply curve, we've moved to something like S2, and when it shifts to the right, it's going to look something like S1. So then let's think about what happens when the curves shift. X marks the spot, our economist's favorite word, equilibrium. Yep, you have to get used to it in economics because we use it a lot. In our diagram, X marks the spot of PE1, our equilibrium price, and QE1, our equilibrium quantity. If the demand curve shifts out to the right from D1 to D2, our new X spot has a higher equilibrium price at PE2 and a higher equilibrium quantity at QE2. As the demand curve shifts to the left from D1 to D2, our new X marks the spot, denotes a situation where price has fallen to PE2 and the quantity has fallen to QE2. Now let's look at a decrease in the supply curve. S1 is shifting to S2. Our new X marks the spot is showing that the price has gone up to PE3, but the quantity has come down to QE3. Where the supply curve increases from S1 to S2, our new X marks the spot shows that the price has fallen from PE1 to PE3, but the quantity has increased to QE3. Okay, so now what about if we apply these laws of supply and demand to the real world? And let's go back in time to our original quiz question around about the time of the Civil War. Well, the demand in wartime pushed the demand curve out. And also, at that time, alcohol was actually a substitute product for oil lighting. So actually, when a tax was placed on alcohol, it also increased the demand for oil, a substitute product. And in fact, the price was 5 times higher within 5 years. In 1901, well, at the start of the 20th century, saw the rise of the oil giants, the big American companies like Gulf and Texaco and Anglo-Persian Oil, which later became BP, and Shell. Saw the market really, the supply increased greatly. So our new X marks the spot here showed lower prices and higher quantities. The war, First World War from 1914 to 18, so as we looked at earlier, that war does tend to increase demand, and in fact, the price of oil doubled from 81 cents to 198, even more than doubled by 1918. So we saw that the price had gone to PE2 and the quantity had gone to QE2. In After the war, we saw increases in both curves. Supply increased due to big new players in the market, such as Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, but also some demand increasing as a result of the outbreak of the Second World War. And what happens here is we can certainly see that the X marks the spot, so that quantity is going to be vastly increased due to the supply curve moving out and the demand curve moving out. But the actual price, we can't really see what is going to happen. It really would depend on a further analysis here to see if we drew those with the supply curves and demand curves of S2 and D2 with slightly different angles, it may impact what happens to price. We can certainly say for sure that quantity would go up. After the war, there were big supply changes and increases in supply as the Americans and the Russians flooded the market and supply increased greatly, and we could see our new X spot with a greater amount of supply. So quantity had moved to QE3 and the price had come down to PE3. In 1973, some countries got together, I may see at the top in OPEC, to limit the supply of oil. They had clearly been to an economics class because those shortages created a price increase and the price of oil moved from PE1 to PE3 as the quantity was reduced from QE1 to QE3. In 1972, oil was $2.48 a barrel, and we saw that S1 to S2 moved it out so that by 1974, the price of oil was $11.58. What we could say is that that reversed somewhat in that 2010 we saw that the US entered the fracking market, pushing the supply curve back from S2 to S1 and reversing those possible price increases. Actually, in 2020, we saw that a really interesting situation where the price actually went negative for a very short space of time. The coronavirus certainly decreased the demand for oil, and we saw a shift in the demand curve from D1 to D2, and we saw a shift in the supply curve because the agreement to restrict oil kind of fell apart with the discussions between Saudi and Russian governments. So what happened was that the suppliers actually had to take their oil away from those fuel tanks that you can see in Central America, in the central United States of America. Those oil suppliers had to actually take their supplies away because the tanks were so full they couldn't receive any more. So again, in this situation, what we have, we can certainly say that it had a negative impact on price as PE1 fell to PE2, but those counteracting changes would mean that we are not entirely sure exactly where quantity would end. What does all that mean in the real world? What we would see is that if we can relate the price of oil, we can look at the red line as the cost in 73 prices, but really we can kind of put together all these events which show you when oil prices go up and when oil prices come down is very much related to our old friends supply and demand. And so what can we actually learn about this as far as economists are concerned? Well, Arthur Schlesinger wasn't too complimentary about economists. He said that we are about as useful as astrologers in predicting the future. And like astrologers, we never let failure on one occasion diminish certitude on the next. I leave you to make up your own mind on that one. Okay, that should be the end of our look at the market mechanism and oil price fluctuations. Hope you enjoyed it.